There is no asterisk when Jesus is teaching to the crowd that we must love God and love our neighbor. Now, sometimes when we read Jesus teaching a lesson, it almost seems like the lesson raises more questions than what it seems to answer. But not this time. He gets the lawyer to answer the question the lawyer had asked. He gets the lawyer to give a quote from the Bible and lays out the basics of what God expects of us as human beings. What is written in the law, he says. And the lawyer answers, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your might, and your neighbor as yourself. What's more than Jesus teaching this lesson is the fact that we also see Jesus living out this lesson, because that is the way he lived his life in such a generous and gracious way every day. But of course, those who were asking the questions weren't asking the questions because they wanted to learn. They wanted to entrap Jesus. They were, in fact, looking for maybe an exception. And so there was a question of how to narrowly define neighbor. The Greek word for neighbor is very much like the English word in that its origins have to do with being close to, being in proximity to someone. And so the question, who is my neighbor, may be more like, well, how close do I have to be to someone in order for them to count as my neighbor? How near does near have to be? And that's when Jesus tells the story that we've acted out before you of an unfortunate person who got beaten up and was left for dead on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Two religious people decided that they would not get involved, and they sidestepped where the victim was. The one who stops to offer care is a Samaritan. That in of itself was meant to be a shock, because Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. Samaritans understand themselves as being ancestors of two northern tribes of Israel, and they wanted to stay in the land during the exile where the people of the Israelites were taken away from the land. Meanwhile, the Jews think that these Samaritans are actually foreigners who were brought in by the occupying army to populate the land. In other words, they are enemies almost to the death. How can an enemy be the role model of what it means to be a follower of God? How can an enemy be the one that shows me who a good neighbor is supposed to be? I wonder who we would choose as that character in a modern retelling of the story. A character that would so shock us into thinking about God's word differently. Would it be a KKK member who stops and cares for the person on the side of the road? Would it be a foreign spy who stops and cares for the one on the side of the road? You know the story. And I wonder if we could consider one aspect of the story which it's almost like it blends into the background. We might not notice it, and that is the setting of the story. The story takes place on a road from Jerusalem to Jericho, which was known to be a dangerous road where robbers hid. It was known to be a difficult road to travel. And so, when Jesus started the story, it would not have surprised anybody in the crowd to hear that somebody got beaten up and robbed on that road. And that's what I want to highlight. There was no shock in the robbery. There was no shock in the fact that somebody was left for dead on the side of the road. That was normal to them. There was an expectation that something like this would happen. Something like this would happen in that place. That's what you get for going to that place. That is not the safe part of town. You would expect something like that to happen. So don't come crying to me if after you do what you shouldn't have done, you get beaten up and robbed. Don't come crying to me and don't ask me for my pity. What's more, as the story develops, the people who go by on the other side, the priest and the Levite, they have perfectly reasonable explanations of why they don't stop. They would have been made impure in the sense of the religious purity laws. They shouldn't touch somebody who was dead because they thought he was dead. They thought that he was beyond help. And emotionally, they are detached. This is the way things should be, and I am not going to get involved. I'll keep my head down and avoid being in this part of town again. The system is working as it should. And then comes the Samaritan. He's no hero. But he's the one that stops. He's also not one of ours, but he's the one that cares for this Jew who's beaten up on the road. And yet he's the one that Jesus uses to make us realize what it means to be a neighbor, the risk-taking involved, the willingness to question a system that literally is beating people up. One sermon to preach could certainly focus entirely on the actions of the Good Samaritan, and that'd be worthwhile. But I challenge us to think about that setting in a broader understanding of what the story is trying to tell us. There are systems in place against the life that Jesus is trying to have us live. There are things that are set up in such a way that make it difficult for us to live the life Jesus wants us to live. Now, we can compartmentalize our life in such a way that there are entire swaths of reality we don't have to care about or worry about. What that parable makes me question is, why are things that way? Why is that neighborhood over there perceived as being safe while this one over there is assumed to be unsafe? Well, no, don't go there at night. And do I give myself permission not to think of the people that live in that unsafe neighborhood? And do I give myself permission not to see them as my neighbors? What Jesus is challenging is our defensive assumption of proximity. Because as Marietta was telling the children, they are all our neighbors. The parable makes us think of the lengths that we will go in order to keep those systems in place as they are. Because we will simultaneously, as a society, we will simultaneously blame people who live in poverty, and at the same time we defund government programs which help them. We simultaneously worry about the rise in homelessness, even in a small town as ours. And then we ignore the reality that there's an absence of affordable housing. And just for a modern version of this biblical tone deafness, in the West Bank today, that road, the one from Jerusalem to Jericho, that has been open for 5,000 years and people have traveled up and down it all the time, now that road is cut off by the separation wall erected by the Israeli government, and it's keeping Palestinians from being able to go from Jerusalem to Jericho in Palestine. Why are the cards stacked against us for being neighbors? When Jesus taught us to love God and to love one another, that lesson is pushing us to question the system, the reality that we live in, which benefits us, but maybe not others. The situations, we question the situations and the circumstances where we intentionally or unintentionally get released of responsibility of those people. However it is that we have defined those people in order to keep us from seeing them fully as neighbors. The challenge for us then is covering the physical and emotional distance that is separating us from the other, so that we will be indeed close to each other, just like God is asking us to be close, just like the Samaritan chose to be close. And by being closer, in the process, we will get closer to God. Thanks be to God for God's word today for us. Amen.